Hi, I'm the Brewmaster. Welcome to the Blind Eternities Tavern. I really like playing Magic the Gathering, and whenever somebody asks me about it, I like to say that Magic is a little like chess. You have a lot of different pieces and they all do different things, but there's one very important difference between Magic and chess. And that's that in Magic, you can lie. There's a whole lot of information that your opponent doesn't have access to. A lot of cards that don't exist on the table. Some cards that might not leave your deck in the first game. So I want to teach you how to lie in Magic the Gathering. I've got a couple untapped islands and a handful of cards, so pull up a chair, have a seat at the table, and whether you're a button mash hack and slash controller bash, or a meeple moving mastermind of maps, mats, and minis, if you ruffle at the awful riffle shuffle scuffle, or if you're a click clack pick attack number ball luck sack, we're all here for the same reason. I'm Jake, let's talk games. So before we get into how to lie in Magic the Gathering, I think first we need to cover when you have to tell the truth. I think there's a range of truthiness that's necessary when you play a game of Magic. And the highest level, the things you must answer, are the things that are public information. The cards that are face up in play, the cards that are face up in your graveyard, the cards that are face up in exile. If your opponent asks you questions about anything that is in those zones, you should answer truthfully. If they ask you questions about how many cards you have in your hand, you should answer truthfully. And if they ask you how many cards left you have in your library, give it your best guess, unless it's really important. Those public zones are public information, and people are allowed to ask about them. But let's move a little bit beyond the must answer truthfully into the should answer truthfully. You know, a lot of people play Magic in a casual setting. I myself rarely play in actual tournaments. And so for me, if somebody asks me a question about what my cards do, I'm going to answer not only honestly, I'm going to answer within the context of the rest of the board. Right? I'm going to say, well, this creature taps for mana. But it actually taps for enough mana that it goes infinite with this artifact. Right? I'm going to say that if this enchantment resolves, I'm going to go for an infinite loop here. I'm going to say this tutor is kind of important if I'm playing with somebody that doesn't really understand the game. If you're playing competitively, all bets are off. Only answer the questions that you must. But I think there's a lot of mechanics in Magic that get complicated quickly, and the more you can kind of assist with the clarity of the game, the better the gameplay is going to feel. Because nobody wants to lose with a counterspell in their hand because they didn't understand what that artifact did. Now, obviously, countering a tutor that puts into play an artifact that takes, immediate effect and locks everybody out of the game might be a bit of a different story. If they start letting your transmute artifact resolve and you're able to get a combo piece to win, I think that's more defensible. But even so, if you're playing with new players, give them the benefit of the doubt. Not everybody knows how to play this game. And not everybody knows how each card interacts. But with that out of the way, without this kind of earnest level of playing the game, let's talk about how to lie, how to be deceptive. What areas of this game can we skew in our favor by being a little bit secretive? So now let's talk about how we lie in Magic the Gathering. Most of that lying comes down to where the hidden information exists. So I think first we'll start with hidden information in zones that we can see, right? Cards that are hidden in plain sight. This could be creatures that are morphed, but you can get more creative with that. There's ways of manifesting cards off the top of your library. The new Manifest Dread mechanic allows you to get very creative with what you're putting into play as 2/2 creatures. Some of those creatures can be flipped up later, but others are lands, enchantments, instants, and sorceries. Alternatively, you could have cards that you are casting into exile with abilities like Foretell, to reveal later. There's things like Suspend that get exiled face up, but that's no fun. Your opponent knows what's coming. But if you foretell a card, your opponent doesn't have a way to interact with it. They can't take a peek at your hand or have a counterspell ready because they know what's coming. And it's not really restrictive of when you cast that. So you could do it at any point in time. You can also remove this ability from your opponent somewhat with cards like Telepathy, where you get to see all of your opponent's hands at any time. In a multiplayer game, this might be useful for pointing out interactions that your opponents have to other opponents that are trying to do things. Oh no, I wouldn't do that. He's got the removal for it. You can get really creative with how you lie with just the zones that exist on the tabletop. But I think it goes beyond that because there's always this mystery pile of cards filled to the brim with interaction that your opponents don't know about. And your opponents are wielding their own deck of unknowable cards. And the ways that we can interact with that can get really creative. I'm reminded of a story when I was first playing Magic, and I played a mono-green Stompy deck that topped out at Sylvos, Rogue Elemental. 6 mana for an 8x trample might seem a little fine now, but at the time, that was a very scary creature to get into play. And with Regenerate, it didn't go down easy. That card plus a couple of others would put somebody under the gun pretty quickly. But one of the things that I kept running into is by the time I'd played out a few of my creatures and ramped for some land to get up to that big ticket item, I didn't have a lot of interaction left. To be honest, the deck had very little interaction to begin with, but frequently I'd be sitting with a board filled with land and nothing in my hands, so my opponent knew that they could do whatever they wanted. One of my friends at the time took a look in my deck and said, hey, you have a lot of ramp in here. You're running Rampant Growths, Harrows, a couple other things, but you don't need forests for every single one of your cards. There's not really anything stopping you from running a single island and searching for it when the time was right. Just holding up a couple mana with a couple cards in your hand just to threaten a little bit. To misrepresent your board state is having better interaction than you actually do. And in a one-on-one game, a lot of times that puts you in a position to get that one extra turn. It's kind of a joke, right? Oh man, I just needed one more turn. So build your deck in a way that gets you that one more turn. Just a little bit of delay. Maybe casting the card, delay. But anything to stall that out, anything to make your opponent second guess, lie, just a little bit. And with those couple mana untapped and a handful of cards, you'll find that your opponents are a lot slower to play out every single card they can. And this also works in Commander, because nobody wants to be the person that gets counterspelled. And sometimes just leaving your mana open is enough to get it back to your turn and not take any damage in the process. This deck is one of my favorite decks that lies, for a couple of reasons. One, it runs blue, so it has good interaction, but two, because the whole first half of the game is very different from the second half of the game. So now I want to walk through one of my decks that lies. And it lies in one of my favorite ways. See, the deck pretends to be a completely different strategy than it's actually using. For the first few turns, you feel like you're playing against the classic squirrel opposition deck. Now, if you don't know how that works, you power out a handful of squirrels, and then you play the card Opposition, which allows you to tap down your squirrels to tap creatures, artifacts, and lands your opponent controls. Those two combined with a couple of other artifacts like Static Orb pretty much stop your opponent from ever getting a chance to use their creatures and lands in the way that they want. And so this deck has a lot of the usual stuff that I like to run in that style of deck. I'm running Sapperling Cluster to put some 1/1s out, Acorn Harvest to combo with that and just power out a handful of tokens. But then there is no opposition in this deck. We're running cards like Gush, a couple counter spells like Mana Leak. But how do we win? We're not locking our opponent out in the same way. The second half of gameplay for this deck feels very different than Squirrel Opposition. It uses a mechanic that I really enjoy, but it's only present on a handful of cards. The card of choice for this particular deck is Proteus Staff. See, Proteus Staff has the ability to put one of our creatures on the bottom of our deck, and then reveal cards from the top until we hit a new one, and we get to keep the new creature. It's a really fun interaction. It can be a little chaotic, and you can do some cute things by blocking and then cycling your creatures out to sort of keep the same volume of creatures in play. But we're getting a little more creative than that. See, because our deck only has one creature, and when we use Proteus Staff, the only creature we're ever flipping into is Blightsteel Colossus. And this can happen as early as turn 4. So a lot of times, this deck starts off with a few 1/1 squirrels, a couple counter spells to keep the game slow, and then a 12/12 infect to kill your opponent in one shot. It's not super consistent, it's not super powerful. This deck is very clearly built for the casual table. It takes a couple notes from some classic decks just to give that nostalgia factor, and then causes whiplash with a very quick win. It's an interesting way to play the game. You are relying on your opponent's assumptions about what your deck does. And there's aspects about this deck that make you think it is a much harder control deck. So you start gearing up for the long game. You start holding back cards, assuming there's good interaction that's open. You see your opponent with land open, and you're afraid of what they might be able to do. But because of that hesitation, you create an opening. And you allow me to swing in with a Blightsteel Colossus and take the game. This doesn't really work in other formats. It's almost entirely for just one-on-one casual play. I think you can sort of do similar things in Commander, but it's a little trickier to set up, and it relies on lying to 3 people at once, which, as we all know, is a lot harder to do. But I love building decks like this, and I love toying with some of the hidden elements of Magic the Gathering, playing in ways that your opponent can't actually see at any given time. Playing with strategies that allows you to lie to your opponents. So I encourage you to put together your own deck, your own fun, lying deck, to catch people off guard, steal a couple wins, and do something completely unexpected. It's been nice talking to you.